Hello, good afternoon, Professor Wouter Vandenhole. We would like to ask you a few questions and regarding your thoughts and opinions on some of the salient issues. And thank you for your keynote speech there at the conference room. First of all, what do you believe that are currently the greatest barriers to achieve universal human rights, and what can be done to negate this?
Well, I think one of the important barriers out there is that our human rights framework, from a legal point of view, is quite outdated, and that it focuses too much on this one actor that is out there, the state. I believe if we really want to consider human rights to be universal, which I believe they are, we also have to make sure that we adapt human rights law to current challenges, and these challenges are not anymore and not predominantly anymore with the state, but also with other actors. And this is not to say that we should distract attention from what states have to do as an actor in human rights law, but certainly we should move beyond the state. In addition to that, I think we have to revisit the very Western background of human rights law. And so we have to come to terms with the fact that if we want human rights to be applied universally as universal norms, that the norm creation and also from a moral point of view, not only from a legal point of view, should be much more universal, which may mean that we have to revisit at least the contours of certain kind of legally entrenched human rights. It may also mean that we have to accept new, innovative human rights standards, because these are the key challenges that people face in different parts of the world. So I see these as two major challenges for human rights and human rights law in particular.
Regarding your answers, especially looking to the future of the human rights, what do you believe will be the greatest threat to secure or to the security of the universal human rights in the next, 20 years?
Mm-hmm. One of the big threats I see is that we may be too fundamental in our understanding of some of the human rights. Of course, you have to be principled, but the risk may be that you are so principled that you kind of marginalize yourself. And with you, I mean, in particular, the West. What I see in the discussion after the terrorist attack on the French magazine, because of the way they deal with religious issues in their publications, I think there is a risk that if we too strongly push freedom of expression as an absolute value, that we may in a way estrange other communities from us, rather than that we get into a dialogue. And I think it's a very tricky balance, because of course human rights are supposed to represent very fundamental principles, so in a way they are non-negotiable. At the same time, that's not true from a legal perspective, and so the freedom of expression is a relative right where limitations are allowed. And I think we have really, in a culture of dialogue and debate, look for where we strike the balance between freedom of expression and respect for other value systems and for religions. And so that's, I think, one of the major challenges. If we push human rights too hard and in a too principled way, I think we will simply marginalize it as a point of reference. On the other hand, if we are, of course, too flexible and too relativist when we deal with human rights issues, we will also water it down. And so striking the right balance, I think, is a major challenge in the years and decades to come.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Professor. For my part, I have two questions. The first one being, the world is becoming even more globalized every day, and do you think that this trend would tend to promote or prevent universal human rights? And in which way is this happening?
Mm-hmm. There are different levels of answering that question, and so let me start with a political level, where I see that in a way you could say globalization is a threat to human rights, in the sense that politically speaking, you have to take more and more seriously all the different states that are participating in the debate. And what we see in more recent institutional reforms of human rights monitoring bodies and political bodies where human rights issues are dealt with, if you have more partners you have to speak with and they have very different backgrounds, then there is a real challenge there that you get these difficult discussions as we have seen within the Human Rights Council, whether we shouldn't kind of have respect for religion as a major value that may even trump the freedom of expression, whether we shouldn't recognize that there is also human rights duties and maybe make human rights conditional on the fulfillment of human rights duties. So all these difficult, tricky questions are there because of globalization and the stronger voice of states that used to be much weaker and so not so dominant in the discussion. But at a more substantive level, I think the challenge really is, and the opportunity with the globalization of human rights, is that the underlying basic values can also spread much more universally. And so that may give you cause for discussion, proper discussion on what you think human dignity is about. And that may be tricky if you think of the discussion of gay rights in countries where that is almost unthinkable. Bringing in that dimension, globalizing this idea that human dignity also includes these aspects of your identity that relate to your sexual identity, I think is an enormous opportunity, but we have to do it in a very careful way. But so it depends on which level you take the question, but generally speaking, I see more opportunities than threats in this globalizing trend.
So you were saying that human rights are linked to cultural identities, which actually leads to my second question. Do you believe that the right to culture and cultural expression should be protected as a basic human right? And how far should this protection extend?
It's a very challenging question. Maybe to begin with, we do have already at least some seeds in the human rights structure, you could say, in the norms that we have acknowledged, in particular in one of the UN covenants on economic, social and cultural rights, where we have some starting points. So some will argue that the right to culture and to cultural identity is to a certain extent already recognized in the human rights law, but it's typically the right we forget about. And that has, certainly from a legal perspective, also not yet been developed or not very strongly. At the same time, we see that there's more and more claims to that. And we have a discipline, I think, anthropology, that also can inform us how to understand this claim also from a human rights perspective. What I see as the basic challenge is that if a claim to cultural identity is meant to kind of block development and progress in all respects, then it's very tricky and dangerous. If a right to cultural identity would be there to reject gay rights, to take that example again, if a right to cultural identity would be used to block any economic progress of the majority of the population in the name of a minority of 2% or 1%, then I think we are running into problems. If we have a dynamic understanding of culture, then I think it's also good to have this right to cultural identity much more developed in human rights and also in human rights law, I think. And typically it would be what we call technically then a relative right, so where we do accept that limitations are possible for a number of legitimate interests that are identified, including the general interest, and where the main question will be, at least in litigation, but I think it can also help outside the law, the main question is then how do you balance this right to cultural identity with other legitimate claims, public goods, and other human rights. And the balancing is then the most important challenge. So I'm not afraid of a right to cultural identity if we understand culture in a dynamic way. And I think that the challenge is not in acknowledging that this right can be an important human right that we should further develop, but in dealing with all the conflicts that will inevitably arise with other rights and with other interests, public goods, and there we have to look into the balancing act then.
Okay. Professor, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with the ICD, and also thank you in the name of all the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, I thank you for coming to the Hague Summit on Human Rights.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.